Last evening, Archbishop Lucas celebrated confirmation for the young people of our parish. And as he spoke to them about the call to be saints. And not just to the young people that were gathered here, but to everybody assembled in the church. That we have a call to be saints. And sometimes we forget this, that sainthood is reserved for someone else, or sainthood is for those who really don't live life in this world fully. But rather sainthood is for boring people, or for old people, or for people far away in long roads, but not for us today. But the reality and the challenge is, sainthood is something to which God calls all of us. And what does it mean to be a saint? But to live in holiness. To experience the gifts that God gives us in His adoption. That He has chosen you. He has chosen you in baptism. Further confirmed that call in confirmation, and continues to nourish us with the gift of His very self, making us more and more like Him. And that makes us saints. Being a saint isn't about jumping through all kinds of hoops, or fulfilling all kinds of things, or doing all sorts of stuff. But being a saint means being close to God. And just as there are many different kinds of saints, there are many different ways that we live out our lives. Some saints were married, some saints were single, some saints were religious, some saints were old, some were young, some lived very public and big lives, others were very quiet and very small in their call to holiness. But each of them lived in holiness. That is, they realized what God was calling them to do, and by being close to Him, they were able to do it, to live it in their lives, wherever they were. We hear in both of our readings today a story of a vineyard, both in the Old Testament and in the Gospel reading, and how God has built up this vineyard, has done everything. He has created the world. He has built it up. He has given everything that needs to be given, and then hands it over to us. And says, now you take care of what I have made. On the one hand, we may say, well, why do I have to take care of it? It's not my vineyard. But on the other hand, we can approach that and say, God is calling us to be gods ourselves. That He's raising us up to participate in His creation. To be like God over the world. That God gives us that calling. Now that is no small calling, to be like God. That's what it means to have dominion over the world. We hear that in the creation story. That God created man and woman and gave them dominion over all the earth. Dominion. To be Lord over. To be like God over. To love. To nurture. To bring forth fruit. Not to have our way with it. That's not what dominion means. That's what domination means. When we dominate another, we cause them to be subservient. We take the first place. But to have dominion means to be Lord. To build up a kingdom where people can flourish. To bear fruit. To let goodness shine forth. And that ultimately is what being a saint is all about. That we're called to be like God. In both stories that we hear today, the fruit does not come forward. And in fact, in the parable that Jesus tells, He paints the picture of a people who have borne fruit, but want to claim it for themselves. This is not God's fruit. This is my fruit. This is what I have done. And they do not want to just be like gods, but they want to be God, to take the place of God. This is mine, to have ownership over it. And in doing that, they separate themselves from the Master. They separate themselves from God, and so cannot be holy. And indeed, Jesus gives that haunting message, not only to the people in his time, but also to us who listen to him today. If you do not bear fruit, that responsibility, that gift, will be taken away from you and given to someone else, someone who will bear fruit. Afterwards, as I was having dinner with the Archbishop, we were talking about this and that, and one of the things that we both reflected upon is how Christians today, how we have a challenge in today's world, because in many ways, we're no longer living in a Christian age. Indeed, I don't even think we're living in a post-Christian age. But in some sense, we have come full circle, and we today have more in common with the very first Christians who lived in a pre-Christian age than anyone else in history. Because at least in a post-Christian age, people, though they may have abandoned the practice of the faith, still remember it. We are encountering so many people today who have never been raised in faith practice, who have no idea what the church used to teach, or what the church does teach us, or what practice of faith looks like, or what the message of the gospel is, that it had not been handed on. There was a break in the generations, and we have gone from that post-Christian, post-modern world of the 60s, 70s, 80s into now a pre-Christian world, where a new evangelization is being called for. John Paul II began stirring up the Spirit and calling upon the church to enter into a new evangelization. And Pope Benedict stressed that in his pontificate, and now Francis is really focusing on this new evangelization. We have to be new saints, very much like the very first Christians. And we have to bring a new message to people. Not a message that says this is the way it has to be, this, that, and the other thing, but a message that inspires people and that brings fruit, that bears fruit. That when we live a life of holiness, when we live a life of love, when we live like God, there will be great fruit. And people will rejoice over that. And they will be drawn to that message. And we cannot just assume that everyone knows what we're talking about. But we really do have to cultivate. We have to work hard now and make that land fruitful. Because it's not just coming natural. And it goes to remind us then of the great responsibility we bear, especially as parents, grandparents, catechists, teachers, the great responsibility we bear to pass on that knowledge. Because if one generation does not pass it on, it disappears. And that's kind of a frightening thought, how fragile that chain, that gift of faith is. If one generation, if a parent stops teaching the child, then that child will be nothing like the grandparent, will not share the gift of faith, will not be able to pass anything on, and will be lost. I remember as a young seminarian working in a military base in Germany when I was overseas studying in Rome. I spent the summer in Germany at an Air Force base helping in the chapel there. And there was one day when both chaplains, the Catholic and the Protestant chaplains, were gone. And this young guy, who was just a year or two older than myself, came in and wanted to talk to a priest or a minister or someone. Well, I was all there was, so hello, here I am. Let's sit down. And we talked for probably a good 45 minutes, and I just listened to his story of woe. Because everything was collapsing in his life, and he was overseas and disconnected from his home, and his marriage was falling apart, and his children were being taken away from him, and this, that, and the other thing. And he had no way of connecting to anyone back home. And then he said it, Father, I wasn't a father at the time, but it didn't matter. He said, Father, I don't even know God. My parents never baptized me. I was never taught to pray. I don't even know if God knows me. I have nowhere to go. When the things of this world let him down, he was completely and totally lost. And it was at that moment when I recognized everything that I had taken for granted, it's so fragile. That the gift of faith that I had received from my parents and my upbringing, that changed my life. That changed my life and gave my life a meaning that this young man didn't possess. How fragile and how beautiful that gift is, and how we have to pass it on. We have to bear fruit. Because if we don't, we're left with nothing. So find that call to be a saint today. As the Holy Spirit was stirred up in our young people yesterday, so the Holy Spirit can be stirred up within our own hearts. And we realize God has called you to be like God in the world today, a pre-Christian world that needs to know Him, because so many have forgotten or who have never heard of Him or even know how to live a good life anymore. So be that witness, be that saint, and enjoy what it means to be working in the vineyard of the Lord.